Very kind and welcome. Thank you to all the brothers who have already led us in our worship this morning. I appreciate very much that your faith has allowed the Lord to guide you in serving Him and serving every one of us by the way that you've been leading us in our service this morning. I see a number of folks that are with us today. My view is if the Lord be with us, the house is full. But it's especially encouraging to see so many that have chosen to be with us this day. The lady who I bought my house from recently used to put signs up on all the walls. And one of them that I really do appreciate was right by the front door. And it says, may everyone who enters as a stranger leave as a friend. And I hope those of you who are visiting with us maybe for the very first time today will experience that. I hope I get a chance to talk with every one of you, but if I have not, please understand that I still consider you to be my friend, even if I've not met you yet. And we are so very thankful that you have chosen to be with us. We're going to begin this morning with Sesame Street. I can remember sitting in front of the television with my children. That was probably the first TV show we allowed them to watch. And I can remember watching it with them, and yes, I enjoyed it. One of the things they used to have on Sesame Street was to have 4 items. Generally have a screen divided into 4 sections. They have 4 items, and they would sing a song about how that 3 of the items were all the same, but one of them was different. And then they would go through the process of explaining why one particular item is different. I always think of that when I start thinking about the 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell us the story of the life of Jesus. Each of them is significant and important in its own way, and yet we understand that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar to one another. They cover many of the same stories. They cover them sometimes from different perspectives or record different statements that are made. But John is odd. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just that fact that John covers different events in the life of Jesus that the 3 synoptics generally don't. And even the ones where John is covering the same event, he covers it from a completely different perspective and viewpoint than the others do. Particularly, I want us to notice the way that each of the 4 Gospels ends. Each of the 4 Gospels looks at what is the most important part, of course, of the story of Jesus, and that is the fact that the tomb is empty. Every one of those Gospels begins, the last chapter is the same pattern. It begins with a tomb that is empty. And then we find where gradually Jesus is revealed to be alive to those who were his disciples. And the amazement and the joy, the incredibility that he really is alive. And each concludes with the same basic message. Jesus meets with his apostles. He gives them a message, a commission. We call it the Great Commission. And then he ascends into the clouds in their view. And as I said, John is different. John, we have 2 chapters, chapter 20 and 21, and begins exactly the same way. It begins with the story of the tomb that is empty. And Jesus is revealed to various people through those 2 chapters of chapter 20 and 21. We even have the very glorious testimony of Thomas, my Lord and my God. And then John has what seems to be the conclusion. Many other things Jesus did and said among us, but these are written that you might believe that he is the Christ, the Son of God. And then as we come to the conclusion of John, in place of that Great Commission and the ascension into heaven, John ends with a fish fry. There's got to be something about that fish fry that it would take the place of the Great Commission and the ascension. And that's what we want to look at this evening. What is it about that fish fry that is so significant, that is so important for us, that John and the Holy Spirit ends his gospel with that? There are three related but yet distinct events. The first one is the collection of the fish itself. We're told that some of the apostles were fishing in the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus appeared on the shore of the sea and gives them instructions how to fish. And they said, we've been fishing all night, haven't got a thing, but following your instruction, they cast their nets where Jesus told them to, and of course brought in a great load of fish, I think 153 fish. That, of course, is an allegory of the Great Commission. It is Jesus telling his disciples how to fish and what's going to come when they do that. So although the other Gospels has the Great Commission in words, John has it in an allegory. The next event that we find there is after they have sat and ate the fish, we find where Jesus is asking Peter a question. He asked him this question 3 times. Do you love me? Most of the translations will have a footnote for you to explain that the words that Jesus used here will change, and the word that Peter responds with will be different than what Jesus used the first couple of times. The two different primary uses of love that we find in the New Testament. Jesus begins by asking from the Greek word agape, do you love me? And Peter responds back with the Greek word phileo. And I know for many years I used to think of that as that Peter was kind of stepping back from what Jesus was asking him, that phileo is somewhat of a lesser word. I've come to realize that's not true. It's a different perspective. Agape love is a love that originates from within me. Phileo love is a love that originates from you. And so Jesus was essentially asking Peter, do you love me because of who you are? And Peter responds, Lord, I love you because of who you are. And Jesus asks again, and Peter responds again. The third time, Jesus changes his word. Peter, do you love me because of who I am? And Peter is grieved and again repeats it. But then Jesus ends with where we're really going to start our lesson this morning. Follow me. And that brings us to the third event, and that's what we're going to focus on. Starting in verse 18 of John chapter 21, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go. Now, John kind of steps away from the narrative to explain to us that Jesus was signifying to Peter the way that he would die. He was going to die violently. And Jesus was letting Peter know that well before that happened. Understandably, Peter was shaken by that. And it says in verse 20, Peter turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back on his breast at supper, and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? Peter, therefore, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, and what about this man? Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. What is that to you? That's the title of my lesson, by the way. And that's what we're going to focus on this morning, is that question. What is that to you? You follow me. There's several different things to consider when we think about what that question means and how that affects us in the way that we live our lives. We're going to look at how it affects those who have never yet followed the Lord. We'll look at it from the perspective of those who do follow the Lord, but they look and see the treatment of the world. And finally, we'll look at it from this perspective of looking at our brothers and sisters and seeing how this affects them. There are a lot of people who try to come up with questions to try to disprove God. You've probably heard many times, if God is all powerful, can he make a rock that is so heavy that he cannot pick up? They think this is the logical proof that God does not exist. Maybe you've heard people ask the question, if heaven is such a wonderful place where there will be no tears, no sorrow, no suffering, how can I be happy there knowing that I have loved ones or friends who are not there with me? How can Jesus be fully divine and fully human at the same time? No question, those are challenging questions. But I kind of have the same answer. What is that to you? In Deuteronomy 29 and verse 29, God through Moses is telling the people that there are secret things that belong to God, but the things that have been revealed are for us to know. God essentially tells us, I told you what you need to know. I told you what is good for you. In fact, the New Testament says everything that pertains to life and godliness. God has revealed all that is good. So why are we looking for more? Why are we trying to find more? What is that to you? In Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, a very important passage for all of us to keep in mind. What God knows and what God does is on a level that is so much higher than any of us could possibly comprehend. We need to understand that you're not going to know God. And you're not going to understand everything about God. You're not going to know everything there is to know. I work in an office. There are people who report to me. There are people who I report to. And several levels up from me, they make decisions. I'm never involved in those decisions. I only find out about them as they affect me. And I don't have a problem with that. What is that to me? We need to understand that God is God. And he doesn't need us to consult with to decide the things that are not significant or important to us. So on one level, this idea of what is that to you is to help us understand we're not God's equal. And we shouldn't try to be. We shouldn't try to step into his place or advise God as to what he should or should not be doing. But let's look a little bit closer at this. In the book of Leviticus in chapter 18, I remember so much Adam, when he was teaching from the book of Leviticus, talking about this concept of holiness and how that the law of God, the law of Moses, was designed to bring the people of Israel to a holiness before God that they had not known before. In Leviticus 18, and beginning at verse 2, God speaks to the people of Israel through Moses, says, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do what is done in the land of Egypt, for where you lived. Nor are you to do what is done in the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You are to perform my judgments and keep my statutes, to live in accordance with them. I am the Lord your God. As children of God, one of the things that we must learn very early is that we cannot be looking around us to have our guidance, to have our examples, to be like them. And yet, of course, that is one of the great temptations of Satan. He's always wanting us to look around and see what's beside us, to see what's going on around us. I've often heard it said that it was relatively easy for God to get Israel out of Egypt. It was impossible for God to get Egypt out of Israel. That's what the purpose of the law of Moses was intended to do, was try to get Egypt out of Israel. We have to do that same thing. We have to recognize God takes me out of the world through the blood of Jesus. but can he get the world out of me? What is that to you? We've got to stop looking at the world around us. We have to recognize that we must be different. Romans chapter 12, after those first 11 chapters that so powerfully sets forth to us what Christianity looks like, what its purpose is, its foundation. Paul says, therefore, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We need to become different. And so whenever we see the things of this world, we see these temptations, I want to be like that. What is that to you? You follow me. That's what our Lord said to Peter. And that's what he says to every one of us. We look at this world and we see people who seem to be a success. The psalmist, Psalm 73, talked about this very thing. Psalm 73, I'll begin at verse 3. For I was envious of the arrogant, and I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For there are no pains in their death, and their body is fat. They are not in trouble as others, nor are they plagued like mankind. Therefore, pride is their necklace. The garment of violence covers them. Their eye bulges from fatness. The imaginations of their heart run riot. They mock. They wickedly speak of oppression. They speak from on high. They've set their mouth against the heavens, and their tongue parades through the earth. The psalmist actually began in the verse before that, in verse 2, saying, that bothered me. That was a temptation for me. He said, I came close to stumbling when I saw that. Well, again, I'll remind you what Jesus said to Peter. What is that to you? You follow me. And part of the problem of asking that question is, why do the wicked prosper? Why are we looking at them in the first place? Why do we care? And I think that's part of the answer to this. Stop looking to see what they have. Stop looking to see what's going on. In the book of Romans in chapter 9, we find where Paul quotes from the Old Testament, specifically the stories of Jacob and Esau, the two brothers. And notice what he says about what God has decided. In verse 14, what shall we say then? There is no injustice with God, is there? May it never be. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. And again, I'll remind you, Isaiah 55. I'm not about to stand in judgment of God and say, well, that's not fair, or that's not right. God is God, I'm not. What is that to me? God has made his decision. God will continue to make his decision. Remember that story of Jonah? We all think about the story of how he tried to run away from God, swallowed up by the great fish. But the really significant part of Jonah is chapter 4. When he finally goes and does what God wanted him to do, and the people of Nineveh repented as God wanted them to, but Jonah did not. And Jonah grieved. Jonah was depressed because here were these wicked people who had oppressed the people of Israel so greatly for so many years, and now God is blessing them instead of destroying them. And God's answer to Jonah was very similar to what Jesus said to Peter. What is that to you? These are my people. I've chosen to do what I want to do. What is that to you? And our attitude needs to be the same. Let God do what God is going to do and stop worrying about what you think should be done. You often hear from people who say, well, I don't want to be a part of that church because it's filled with hypocrites. What is that to you? I don't want to be a part of that group because they got troublemakers there. They always have problems there. What is that to you? Do we use that as an excuse to stay away from God? You'll hear people say, I don't need to be baptized. Thief on the cross was that baptized. What is that to you? We've already talked about the Great Commission. That's in fact what Jesus told his disciples to teach them as they went out into the world. But let's focus primarily for our lesson this morning to talk about what it means as we work with one another. You ever had a time when you're at your job and you find out you're getting a raise? You hadn't expected it. Boy, that's nice. Pretty nice raise. Start to think about what I can do with that money that I've been given. And this is just wonderful. Until you find out a coworker who's doing essentially the same job got a little bit higher raise than you did. Whoa, wait a minute. This is not fair. I'm getting cheated here. A moment ago, you were happy. Why are you not happy now? See, that seems to be what the problem was with Peter. Do you love me? Oh, your Lord, I love you. I love you because of who you are. Follow me, Peter. In fact, the indication is that Jesus and Peter actually got up and started walking. And then Jesus starts to tell Peter, now, Peter, I want you to understand that as you follow me, later in life, this is going to be hard. Later in life, you'll be put to death for my name. And then Peter looks at John. What about him? Is that going to happen to him also? And Jesus says to Peter, if I choose that he stays alive until I return, what is that to you? You follow me. Do we understand what our role is in service to Christ? It is not to do essentially the same as the person sitting next to me. It is not to make sure that my life is no better or no worse than theirs. That I'm supposed to do as much as they do. We talked about in Corinthians that that was a problem that existed in Corinth. They were comparing themselves with one another. And Paul says that's a loss when you start comparing yourself with others. Now, our role is what Jesus said to Peter at the end of the previous story. Follow me. My role is to do what my faith and what God has enabled me to do to serve him in that way. That may be encouraging you in your walk. That may be trying to be a support to you if you're going through those difficult times. Remember the story in Matthew 25, where Jesus had divided them, the left and the right, and they said to him, well, Lord, when did we ever help you out? When did we ever clothe you? When did we ever visit you in prison? He said, when you did it to the least of these, my disciples, you did it for me. That may be my role. But it is not my role to look and say, hey, why ain't I getting the same thing? What is that to you? You follow me. We see many times that that was a problem in the early church. In Acts chapter 5, we find where Ananias and Sapphira saw the fact that Joseph, who was called Barnabas, was receiving acclaim. In fact, the name Barnabas itself was given to him by the apostles or by the early church because of how much people appreciated his encouragement. And so Ananias and Sapphira became jealous and wanted that for themselves. We see in chapter 6 that there were widows who were being taken care of and widows that were not being taken care of. And the jealousy and the strife that caused within the early church. Dipsy just a few weeks ago spoke about the parable that we find in Matthew chapter 20 of the men who are working in the vineyard, some of them working the entire day, some of them working only 1 hour. And the jealousy that those who had worked the entire day had for the ones that had worked an hour. And yet, as the master said, didn't I treat you fairly? Absolutely. He said, if I do what I choose to do with someone else, what is that to you? What is our role in serving Christ? Our role in serving Christ is to follow Jesus. Be focused on Jesus. What about those who are wrong? Surely we have to do something about that, don't we? Look at Romans 14, if you would. Romans chapter 14, beginning of verse 3. Let not him who eats regard with contempt him who does not eat. Let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and stand he will, for the Lord is able to make him stand. What is that to you? Now, I'm not saying that we ignore our brethren, that we just let them continue in a path that we believe is wrong. We find many examples in the Bible where loving Christians went and helped others. We talked about it in our class this morning with Apollos. But we let the Lord decide. And we let the Lord make them stand. What is that to you? Let me conclude our lesson by going back to John chapter 20 or chapter 21. And I want you to notice a very small part of this, quite honestly, something I hadn't noticed before. Remember I mentioned the idea that they had gotten up and apparently started walking down the beach. And when Jesus told Peter about what was going to happen to him and the fact that he would die, in verse 19, John says, this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. Notice that. By what kind of death he would glorify God. This was actually good for Peter because it would glorify his God. And it says that when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. And yet, how does the next verse begin? Peter turning around. Saul, the disciple whom Jesus loved. What did Peter have to do to see John? He had to turn away from Jesus. And I would suggest to you that every time you start focusing on what's going on with the world, what benefits they're getting, or what your brothers and sisters maybe have it easier or harder than you, it's because you've turned away from Jesus. Jesus kept saying, follow me. And the more we keep our lives focused on that idea that I'm following Jesus, I'm not going to worry about what's going on with others. I'm not going to worry about whether that's fair. I'm not going to worry about whether I'm getting it as good as they are or not. I'm doing what I need to do, is follow Jesus. So what is that to you? The only thing that really matters is follow Jesus. Are you one who's made that commitment? Is that indeed your life, is to follow Jesus wherever he goes? Let me suggest to you that no matter what you do in this life, whether like Peter, that means that you would end up giving your life for the cause of Christ. Or whether it be like John, who apparently died of old age in service to Christ. Whatever it means for your life, if you have followed Jesus, you will do the same thing that John said about Peter. You will have glorified God in your life. And anything else? What is that to you? If there's a way that we can help you to follow Jesus, please come to the front now as we stand and sing the song that was chosen.